Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about something very, very important to human society and especially American society, very contemporary and also very historical. Today we're going to be talking about subtle racism. So I'm not going to be talking about slavery, and obviously the foundings of America was formed in large part through racist ideals. I'm not going to be talking about that right now. I'm going to be talking mostly about inadvertent racism and just stuff that most people don't really think about. So, what is racism, first of all? According to Oxford Dictionary, it is prejudice slash discrimination based on the belief that one race is superior to another. So that whites are superior to blacks, or Middle Easterners, such as Saudi Arabians. Saudi Arabians is superior to Palestinians. That's racism. So there's different types of racism, and it's important to break them down. There's direct racism, which are slurs such as the N-word. It's physical acts of violence against certain racial groups specifically because of their race. Or it's things like KKK groups and KKK rallies, organizations specifically designed to antagonize and hurt another race. So that's direct racism. The next one I want to talk about is indirect racism, which is racism you don't really see or don't really think about. It's when old white ladies kind of cross the street to avoid a young black man wearing a hoodie. It's when a group of white people are staring at like a black person who just entered the room. It's when cops pull out to ask a black man walking through, I guess, a rich neighborhood, asking if they're lost or if they need any help. Stuff like that. That's stuff that people kind of notice as racism, but at the end of the day, that's not like equivalent to, I guess, racial slurs or physical acts of violence, but it's definitely racism and should be pointed out. So another part of racism that most people don't even really realize ever could exist is systemic racism. This is when policies, like legal policies and practices in certain like organizations such as the actual federal government or local government, colleges, police systems, right? It's those like laws and policies and practices that are racist themselves that cause inadvertent racism or direct racism all throughout. For an example of this, for an historical example, that would be Jim Crow laws back in the 1900s, I believe, or maybe 1800s, 1900s. Obviously, the Jim Crow laws were very, very popular. They were extremely racist, very outright racist, and they were legal systemic policies that created racism throughout the nation. Another example of contemporary systemic racism, a lot of people are arguing, is the police system. So, as you know, recently, with the certain unjustified killings of people like Breonna Taylor and Eric Gardner, a lot of people have been pushing further and further for the Black Lives Matter movement and have been saying stuff like all cops are bad or all cops are bastards, things like that, because they're protesting the systemic racism within the police system. Now, another one that's even more subtle than most people think is gentrification. So gentrification is very complicated, but to understand it, you need to break it down and you need to realize the premise of ethnic neighborhoods. So ethnic neighborhoods are kind of, I guess, an effect of human nature almost, but it also leads to racial tensions, so to speak. So it's when groups of a certain race, culture, organization literally live in neighborhoods next to each other. So for example, in Long Island, Queens, there's a lot of Indians. There's a lot of Indian shops. There's a lot of Indian grocery stores. That's an example of ethnic neighborhoods. It caters to the Indians that live within, I guess, that area, so to speak. So now gentrification is when you take, I guess, a hood or a ghetto or the projects and you try to build it up. But what happens is that the minorities there, which more often than not is Black or certain Hispanics, certain Hispanic groups or Latino groups, they essentially cannot live there anymore because there's all these new places, all these more expensive places that doesn't fit the lifestyles of the people from the ghetto. So those people are relocated, again, usually minorities more often than not, And who comes in? The white people. They make profit after, I guess, flipping houses in the ghetto, and then it becomes a more white and white neighborhood, and then the minorities get slowly and slowly pushed out. Again, this is more of a cultural process than really direct racism. Again, going back to like acts of violence, but it is it has race related aspects that definitely affect large groups and populations. So it was just very important to know. Gentrification, very bad, kind of hard to really understand, but very important to understand. So now, with racism, a lot of people ask about reverse racism or racism against white people, at least in American society. They're like, is that even real? A lot of people don't think it's real. Some people do think it's real. So to understand reverse racism, we have to understand, well, the definition. It's prejudice directed at historically dominant racial groups. Now, I would like to add something else more to that. It's historically dominant racial groups specific to, I guess, that area or culture. So in American society, the historically dominant racial group is white people, or was white people. It still is, so relatively speaking. So it's when minorities are prejudiced against white people. Now, a lot of people don't think that this is real because minorities don't, at least feel as if they don't have any real legal power. So you can be racist to white people, but at the end of the day, you're not really going to affect or change their lives in the long term or substantially affect them. When a white person is racist to a black person, it can substantially affect their lives more and more. At least that's the argument for saying reverse racism isn't real. Now, an aspect of reverse racism is affirmative action. So a lot of people have heard about affirmative action, but to identify it, affirmative action is when minority groups, specifically like black people, Indian people, Latinos, Latinas, Hispanics, they're given extra opportunities that white people wouldn't have, or people of lower economic standing are given more opportunities that rich people aren't getting, like they're getting extra funding from the government, stuff like that. And a lot of people think affirmative action is racist or classist because it's a separation by race. You're giving more opportunities to one racial group to another. Now, a lot of people also argue the fact that they need this extra benefit to, I guess, even the playing field, so to speak, because of the systemic racism within a lot of institutions in American society. It's a very open debate. I think there is some level of racism to it, but then again, I think affirmative action also does have its merits. Personally, I don't like affirmative action. I think a level of it is needed, especially economically speaking. But that's just my 2 cents on it, and that's just what subtle racism is. That's the breakdown of what racism in our contemporary society is. Is America still racist? I don't think America is racist. I think a lot of people are ignorant about a lot of racial things, and that ignorance leads to inadvertent racism. A lot of well-meaning white people sometimes say semi-racist things or say things that have a racial impact without them knowing. And a lot of it is, I think, a lack of knowledge or lack of understanding of racial issues, which, a lot of these white people are well-meaning, nice people, but they grew up in very, very white people only neighborhoods. They grew up in, I guess, a very sheltered society, not a very open society. For example, in New York, the city I live in, Yonkers, it's almost like a melting pot. There's a lot of different races, there's a lot of different groups, and a lot of white people sometimes don't really have that in their early development. So they've developed certain stereotypes or certain, I guess, ideas in their mind that aren't good to have. They're somewhat racist, but they don't realize it. I think that's where a lot of racism in America comes from. And so it's all about the individual learning as much as they can about racism and trying to discover racism within their own minds and trying to, I guess, prevent themselves and learn from it, prevent others from being racist. And again, it's all about learning from it. It sucks that we live in a society or we live in a nation that has as much racism as it does. I don't think our country's racist. I don't think the majority of people in our country are racist rather. But I think that there is a lot of racial issues in our country that needs to be fixed first and foremost by learning more about it. Thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below.